Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the special session, China's Green Leadership, jointly presented to you by China Global Television Network and the World Economic Forum. This is the very first time that this kind of joint venture happens, so it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you. Our topic, China's green leadership. The question is not about who's taking the so-called leadership, but rather how to lead. What is the relationship between leadership and actions, and how can we act together? In that regard, we're going to have a strong panel to explain from their own perspective. But for now, let's take a look at this video.
Embracing green development, China's government has declared war on pollution after ratifying the Paris Agreement in 2016. Now China boasts 1/3 of the world's wind power, 1/4 of its solar capacity, 6 of the top 10 solar panel manufacturers, and 4 of the top 10 wind turbine makers. And the country sells more electric vehicles than the rest of the world combined. Tech companies are also green innovators. Online technology, particularly e-commerce, internet banking, and social media, is accelerating the pace of change. As the world's largest investing country in renewables, China hit the record high last year, accounting for 45% of global green energy investment. China is on the way to push for a green and beautiful future.
Thank you. So I'm joined here by a very strong panel coming from all over the world, from different kinds of economies, and certainly they also have their own expertise. On my left, my great honor to have His Excellency Jorge Arbache, who is the Secretary for International Affairs with the Ministry of Planning, Development, and Management of Brazil. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Playing. Meanwhile, we would like to welcome Mr. Boqiang, Professor and Dean from the China Institute for Studies in Energy Policy. Thank you, sir. Well, at the same time, my longtime friend, Isabel Hilton, who is the editor of Chinadialogue from the United Kingdom. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Last, but certainly not least, who just had a visit to the local zoo, I understand. He's coming from the United States, Stephen Monfort, director of the Smithsonian National Zoological Park and also director of Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
All right, we have a very tense discussion ahead. Let me start by asking you, are we getting desperate after the Paris Accord? Obviously, some of the biggest economies did not yet want to play a significant role. Maybe I will start from Mr. Monfort.
Well, I think the situation...
Of course, you are not representing any administration.
Of course not. I think we all know that climate change is something that we are having to deal with, and when it comes to, in my own context, I work in biodiversity conservation realm. And so it's a very important, significant figure in terms of species survival, ecosystem function, ecosystem resilience and adaptation, those sorts of things. So in my mind, it is a crisis.
It is a crisis?
Yes.
Do you also see it, Mr. Secretary, as a crisis?
It is indeed a crisis. I think that this is such a topic that requires a lot of collaboration and a lot of partnership. So that the Paris Accord is indeed a very critical instrument for all of us to work together in order to promote all the technologies needed to mitigate the risks associated to climate change.
But how? That is the question, isn't it?
Well, that's perhaps the most critical issue, how to do that. I think that based on the fact that we are talking about a public topic, a public issue that requires co-creation, collaboration, and partnership, we have to develop an agenda that is inclusive, that takes care of all the needs coming from developed and developing economies,
right.
from people and from companies, from governments and from all of us involved in this topic.
Ms. Hilton, we've been in many conversations, but I need to ask you in front of the public again, are we desperate?
We're in a desperate situation. Whether we're desperate is kind of up to us. I spent last week in San Francisco at the Global Climate Action Summit, and there were some barnstorming speeches there which gave you hope again. The fact is that since Paris, the process of global climate negotiations have lost energy. Mr. Trump is one of the factors, but not the only factor. But at the same time, you know, the experience of being at the China Pavilion in San Francisco with a string of memoranda of understanding being signed between California and China, you sense that below the federal level in the United States, there's fantastic energy for this. So we are absolutely in a desperate situation. And essentially, we have maybe 2 decades. And after that, it's over. We have 2 decades to fix this. Technically, we can do it. Economically, it's positive. It's an advantage to do it. Politically, you still have to line up some will.
So it seems that you are saying it's a mixed picture.
Yeah.
Professor Lin.
I'm a pest optimist.
Yeah, well, Professor Lin?
I think that if we don't get together to work, we don't have enough time for it. So I think in the sense that we are desperate. On the other hand, in terms of Paris Agreement, I do believe that the investment in the renewables is keep coming high. So in the sense that the people are still trying to work for it. But the question here is, do we still have enough time or not? Do we need to work harder or not? Whether the certain countries do not agree or has a negative impact, it doesn't matter. We just have to move forward.
I love that, the can-do spirit, isn't it? Having said that, though, Professor Lin, since the topic is about China's leadership, I really wonder whether China is trying to be here and quote-unquote be a leader, or China is trying to see this as an opportunity to work with the others to find new ways of solution, Professor.
I think that China do not claim really to be a leader, but it is a leader because in the sense that if you look at renewables, we just watch the TV footage that we are the largest system. Our investment accounted for majority of the global renewable investments. If you look at our target on 2020, for example, we are asking for 200 gigawatt of wind and 100 gigawatt of solar. Up to this point, we are basically meet the target and surpass the target. So moving forward, I believe that China will continue to work not only in China, also together with the country and low and bear initiatives on the green development.
The innovation in the energy sector is certainly very interesting. But to what extent, Mr. Secretary, that these innovation possibilities will be able to replace the so-called traditional? That is a big question mark. For Brazil, what exactly is this picture?
Well, this is an agenda driven by innovation. If you want to act, if you want to be a player, you have to be on the frontier in terms of innovation, being financial innovations, being new technologies, being all these new tools that will help us tackle the climate warming agenda. I think that you mentioned energy. We are developing in Brazil, in China, and some other countries new technologies that will improve efficiency in the one hand and optimize usage of energy. Take the case of ultra-high transmission lines. This is a very interesting technology that help us improve efficiency, reallocate energy according to the needs, so that in the end of the day we may have or impact less the environment. This is one interesting example. The other one is related to biofuels. There's a lot going on in Brazil, in China, and in some other parts of the world related to the bioeconomy. This is indeed something very interesting that we have to pay a lot of attention.
What is distinguishing a leader and a follower is possibly the capability to take advantage of innovation. Mr. Monfort, about the innovation part, how much observation have you got about developing countries, emerging economies, or certainly some parts of the United States as well, about the mechanisms and the tools to be used?
Well, I'm a conservation biologist, so the first thing I would say is to pay attention to our natural capital. Much of our solutions for climate change are going to come from better reducing deforestation, for example. And there's a great deal of progress we could make with land restoration and improving land use management practices, for example. So everything from agricultural practices to general land use management. We live in what I would call a landscape mosaic now, where nature and humans and agriculture are all mixed together. And we don't have a very good understanding of how those systems actually function. And so there's a greater need for basic science to understand ecosystem function and the services that are being provided. But we're already deriving trillions of dollars of benefits from what exists. So the first thing is to do no harm. To, when you're going to be developing, to do hand in hand with understanding what you can do with natural capital. Mm-hmm.
Well, these all sound kinds of abstract in a way if we talk about the concepts. But Professor Lian, I understand carbon trading has already become a national scale in China. But the question is, how well is that tool, that innovation being used? And how used to is Chinese, in a way, these days about that practice? Professor?
Well, it's a broad trading system. Even though that right now, China announced last year to establish a national carbon trade system, which at this moment only included 1,700 coal-fired power plants. But that makes sense because a national carbon trading for China is an enormous market. And at this moment, that first batch will roughly cover 1/3 of the carbon emission in China. And if we can success, that will be the largest carbon trading system in the world. Having said that, the trading is expected in 2020 because at this moment we're still preparing the infrastructure, provide training for personnel, and also try to establish somehow an efficient trading system based on the pilot testing of which we had carried out a few years ago.
Help me to understand this, Ms. Hilton. I mean, China's emission seem to have already peaked, some suggest, by the year 2016, much earlier than the earlier plan. That probably means that Chinese economy is slowing down as a result of structural reform, but that could also mean a great opportunity for China to take advantage of all the possible innovative tools, carbon trading included. Ms. Hilton, how should we understand this earlier than expected peaking of the emissions, and therefore the opportunities and challenges as a result?
Well, there's always more than one answer with China. The earlier peaking than anticipated is partly because China sets cautious targets because it likes to meet them. And so, talking to climate people here in China over 2 or 3 years, nobody expected it to go much beyond 2022, but the promise was by 2030 or earlier. So that's one reason. But the material reason is, as you say, about the changing economy. China has been through this period of very fast, very high emitting, very polluting growth. And that phase is pretty much over now. So it's making a transition to a higher value, higher technology economy, cleverly identified the technologies of the future as low carbon technologies, massive investment in that, and has brought down the price of those technologies for everybody, not just for China. So where does trading come in? Trading is a mixed picture. It does a couple of very useful things. It makes you count your emissions. You need accurate data in order to be able to trade, and it puts a price on carbon, and that has been the problematic thing. Because how do you get people to do the right thing if they perceive it as an economic negative? So if you set a high price on carbon, it becomes a net positive for an enterprise to reduce its emissions. The problem with the European system, as I'm sure you know, is that the price never really got to be useful. It was always too low. So some countries are setting a floor price, a price below which carbon cannot fall. in order to make sure that it actually saves carbon as opposed to doing a lot of other things.
Right. Before we go into the details about how the carbon trading really works in China and in other economies, let me ask you, Professor Lian, specifically about the earlier peaking than expected. How do you see that phenomenon? Is it going to be sustainable? And that certainly has a lot to do with what kinds of technologies, what kind of innovation that China is thinking about for the future when it comes to carbon trading. And this, of course, is not limited to China, but also the other emerging economies, as we have Brazil sitting here as well.
Right. Let's talk about China first.
Go ahead.
Targeting 2030, as we all agree, that's definitely, we're going to mean that much earlier. 2022, yes, that's totally possible. Some people even mention that we already peaked by 2013 because at that time the coal consumption is higher.
Yes.
It's, in a few years, it looks quite optimistic. But last couple of years, because of the energy demand coming back, and the coal and solar are too small to cover the incrementals. Yes, the coal consumption has come back a little bit over last 2 years. So looking forward, it really depending on the energy demands. If energy demand come up very strongly, then the coal will continue to come back in the positive side. Then we are looking at we need to evaluate the coal, the carbon peaking in 2013. But 2020, 2022 certainly should be more or less the number we are looking at. Carbon trading, I believe that it's going to have a huge impact on the peaking, even though we're talking about maybe a different topic, but they are really related. We have carried out extensive research on the carbon trading system, looking at different angles, looking at different prices, and we find out that, in fact, it's really an effective system to reduce the CO2 in China with some acceptable GDP negative impacts. So I think this is going to apply to other countries, even though they're different countries have different situations. But I'm hoping that China, being a developing country, have a good carbon trading system will set up an example for other developing countries.
I have to go to Mr. Monfort before I come back for Mr. Secretary. Mr. Monfort, once again, you are not representing any administration, but just from a conservationist perspective, you see the apparent trade war going on between China and the United States. That certainly is going to, in a way, have an impact on the manufacturing sector, particularly here in China. And therefore, it would have an impact also on China's way of dealing with its environment, about China's efficiency of using new tools to make environmental improvement. Certainly has a lot to do with the innovation that we're talking about here. So Mr. Monfort, how do you see this general, much bigger economic, geopolitical scenes, their impact on what we are talking about here? Because these are certainly going to have quite much influence on where the future is heading. Mr. Monfort.
Well, my perspective is as a scientist and again as a conservationist, and I would say that we need to make sure that these trade issues and other issues between the United States and China don't impede our partnerships on the scientific and technology front. We have long-standing relationships with Chinese colleagues, and so it's important to keep our eyes on the longer picture. And in my view, development is one of the major issues that's coming onto the scene for China. And as that happens, I believe there needs to be a better integration between the scientific sectors and the private sector, the NGO conservation sectors. There needs to be new types of cross-sectoral partnerships, and there really needs to be an increase in the standards of practice and also a philosophy that integrates conservation into development practice. That shouldn't be something that's separated from it. And too often there are wars basically going on between interest groups for the environment and interest groups for the industry. And in my experience with the Smithsonian, we have excellent relationships with certain companies that are interested in raising their standard of practice, raising their image, and doing the right thing. So, while we're talking about carbon trading and all types of other mechanisms, the fundamental thing is, again, do no additional harm as you go forward in development. And there are ways to develop in a responsible, sustainable way. But right now, my opinion is that there's a lack of capacity in that area. If you look at the scientific and technical capacity. It's very high in China and in many developing countries, in engineering, for example, in law and medicine, fields like that. But if you look at fundamental science, environmental science, biodiversity and conservation science, it's been lagging very far behind. And I think there's a risk that we can engineer almost anything. But if we don't understand the systems that we're about to disturb in advance, and we don't know how to mitigate the negative impacts, then we're going to continue to make the same mistakes that have been made historically. So there needs to be more investment in understanding the environments that these companies are working in. There's tremendous damage that can be done through mega infrastructure development. I think those are well documented. And so we know what the problems are, we know what the threats are, but are we going to be smart enough to avoid them?
Yeah, can we be, Mr. Secretary, the emerging economies in fact could have this possibility of so-called leapfrog. We do not have to hit the same walls as the others hit through the various generations of industrialization, while at the same time acquire the new tool. And yet, do our economies allow that to happen? Do our urgency of doing things allow that to happen, Mr. Secretary?
Yes, that's a very important question. I think that there are at least two fields where leapfrogging can be indeed very critical for developing and emerging economies. One is the digital economy, and the second one is environment. There is a huge demand for us to do more and better things related to these two fields. The technologies are still being developed, so the potential is there. There's a lot to be done. The market is huge. The potential market is huge. So developing and emerging economies can indeed participate in the development of the technology and in the development of the tools needed to make these two areas very, very important.
Give me an example about Brazil, for example.
Well, Brazil is doing a lot in terms of biofuels, in terms of the bioeconomy in general. Brazil is already a clean energy country. The large majority of the energy produced there comes from hydro, from renewable and things like that. So being a clean matrix is not enough. You have to do more in terms of energy conservancy, in terms of how you deal with your cities, garbages and things like that. And even more important than that, the thing is related to the way you organize and structure your economy. In the case of a developing economy or an emerging economy like Brazil, in order for you to become more efficient, in order for you to be in a position to create value out of technologies, you have to do more in terms of intangibles. In terms of developing technology, in terms of developing areas where value creation is there. That's perhaps what is happening in China.
Yeah.
You mentioned the case of China having peaked before planet. That indeed has to do with the structural transformation of the Chinese economy towards a more service economy based rather than a manufacturing and export-oriented economy. For us to do more in terms of clean energy, for polluting less and less, we have to help economies from around the world.
I see a role doing a planning, for example, in your country. When you are saying this to your colleagues in the administration, do they really understand? Can they really support you in that cause?
Well, that's a key question again, because there is a kind of a short-term versus long-term perspective.
Absolutely.
So some politicians and some policymakers are more concerned about what to do in the short term in order to create value, in order to grow. Some others are actually looking at the future.
Literally you, I guess. You have to look at the future because you're doing planning.
I should. I'm supposed to, yes.
Mr. Monfort, I see you want to say something in regard to what Mr. Secretary is saying.
No, I think it's right. I mean, we need to be looking at the longer term picture. And you know, when you're working in a field like conservation, for example, I've been 30 years. I've seen administrations come and go. We can still continue to make progress. There's and
you look calm.
Yeah. Well, we don't have a choice. So, my idea is to keep our eye on the ball with respect to where we're trying to go. I think that we can be successful. I like to focus, I tend to be an optimist, I suppose, but I am concerned that the whole issue of climate change, in effect, has almost overshadowed the more basic damage that we've done to the environment for hundreds of years. And I'm talking about things that we all know: pollution and habitat loss and fragmentation, invasive species, and those types of causes. So I think we have, in keeping our eye on the ball, that means not just looking at climate change and mitigation. Let's just say that climate change, great success happens, and 20, 50 years from now, we check that off as a success. What are we going to do if our natural capital, our ecosystem, have been destroyed, they're not functioning? Those trillions of dollars of benefits won't be recovered. These are things that we just take for granted, I think, but clean air, clean water, food, and fuel and fiber, these are essential to our survival. We need to pay attention to that as well.
Oh my God, Mr. Monfort, you are making us struggling with priorities for this discussion. What can we do, Ms. Hilton?
I think it's very important to understand, we on this panel, I'm sure we think about these things all the time. There are economists, industrialists, and politicians who don't think about it at all, and they make their decisions unrelated to this emergency. Everybody has to make informed decisions informed by climate, because otherwise we're not going to get there. And that changes the way we think about economics.
I heard you say that very often in many of the previous discussions we had as well. But I really want you to explain to our audience, sitting here today, for example, about exactly using what kinds of mechanism you will make the politicians and the decision makers, like Mr. Secretary, and particularly his colleagues, to look much longer term than just next year's election or the year after the next.
Right, for the politicians, there are different answers. For
That's a trillion-dollar question, I have to say.
For the politicians, it's the people who need to demand of their politicians that they do the right thing. For all the other sectors, that's the role of public policy. How do you transform an economic equation from the negative to the positive through tax, through incentives, through all those things that are part of public policy?
The question is how, isn't it? What is the how? How should we answer that how?
Well, the how is, it depends on the sector you're looking at. A high price on carbon is one how. Penalties for doing the kind of damage that Steve's been talking about is another how. When you set your resource extraction priorities, you absolutely need to factor in resource economics and environmental economics. This isn't a linear. China went in one direction for nearly 20 years and now is paying the price. And it's really important that China doesn't transmit the negative lessons to other countries, but transmits the positive ones.
Well, Ms. Hilton seems to always have a lot of concerns about China. Professor Lian, what do you think? Not necessarily China's approach, but really the bigger question about how. Exactly how can we build it into the mechanism so that governance could pay attention to that no matter which country or which economy we are talking about, a little bit longer term.
Okay. Let me first comment on the priority. In fact, if you look at the priority of ecosystem, air pollution, and CO2, it looks like CO2 is actually very far away from politicians. The air pollution is actually more closer because, for example, the air pollution in Beijing really asking the government to reduce the coal burning near the Beijing very quickly. So I would say that in fact all those are mixed together. Environmental are integrated into each other. For example, if China try to reduce the CO2, you have to reduce the coal. Reduce coal, you will reduce air pollution, and also other water pollution, etc. Yeah, everything are all linked together. So I would believe that the target is basically there: environment, air pollution, CO2. They're all together. Now, as your second question, the second question is how we're going to do it, and I believe that different countries will have different approaches.
What about China? Let's just say your example.
China now is quite clear. We are looking at a better quality GDP. What I mean is that it can measure by several indicators like GDP per energy consumption of how much GDP we produce, energy efficiency, right, and the energy structure. All of those are all very good indicators of how China moving forward in terms of a better environment and also less CO2 emission. And I believe that also apply to other countries too. We cannot only just look at one indicator or one. We have to balance pictures, approach, yeah.
And we've all signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, which lay that out. So, you know, we do have a roadmap.
You asked how. I think that I have two comments. One is related to awareness. Of course, the climate change provides or creates a huge, there's a huge potential for economic growth. And not necessarily everybody is aware of the potential. So many people would otherwise think of climate change as an opportunity for doing business, for making a lot of money. So it's a matter of communication and awareness, both for the business community and for politicians. And number two, it has to do with the thing related to winners and losers. So we have to develop policies in a way to mitigate the risks involved, the risks associated with those that are losing when we promote all these new technologies. So we know what to do. And the thing, again, is related to the tension between short and long term.
Well, I guess my point was that government policies and regulatory frameworks and so on are very important. But the private sector, the business sector, they have the ability to move forward on their own and to do things in a sustainable way because it makes economic sense, or because their customers demand it, let's say. So I'm confident, I'm more confident than in the private sector being innovative and partnering in creative ways to make solutions than I am in governments to regulate our way to solutions.
But since we were struggling with the priority question that you have been raising earlier, Mr. Monfort, the same with involving the private sector, it is going to be very helpful, obviously, to sustain this approach. And yet, when the private sector is involved, we all understand everybody is asking for attention, and particularly regarding their own sector and their own industry. And therefore, there's another issue about priorities when it comes to policymakers' decisions. Mr. Monfort.
I'm not sorry. I'm sorry I get the question.
Yeah. The question is, when private sector is involved, they all want to have the biggest attention for their own sectors. And therefore, there is a priority struggling for the governance, in a way, to figure out.
I think it's common for different companies to want to be seen as leaders. I think it's the same for China in terms of showing leadership now in their new programs of development.
What about for the United States now? I'm not talking about the federal government. I'm talking about private sector and some of the other areas. It's not just about China showing the leadership. It's about everybody doing their part, isn't it, Mr. Monfort?
Yes, it is.
Give me some examples.
Well, I can think in the U.S., you know, companies are really ignoring, to some extent, the short-term administrative moves by the Trump administration, and they're looking for the longer term. So they're looking beyond one administration and making changes that are best for their companies.
Give me some example, could you?
The companies that come to mind, like Walmart, let's say, or Mars, these are companies that are voluntarily moving towards zero carbon footprints within the next decade. So they're taking these moves on their own because I think it's because they think it's the right thing to do, but it's also economically beneficial, and their customers are beginning to expect it. But ultimately, it's because it makes sense from a profit point of view.
Not only innovation when it comes to tools, but also innovation when it comes to mechanism. Professor Lin, China has been advocating together with some of the other partners about the so-called Belden Road Initiative, which to the explanation from the Chinese side is more about connectivity of all kinds, particularly at the very beginning stage about infrastructure. But many people also question whether the best practices when it comes to environmental protection, emission reduction, and also the future of the biodiversity will be practiced and used during this process. Professor Lin, how do you see that?
I think to begin with, China has a huge capacity, and also they're very good one also. Can be shared with those infrastructure needed of the bare and low initiative countries. As I mentioned earlier, different countries will have different approaches. However, that we are hoping that all other countries along the Belt, particularly developing countries along the Belt and Road initiatives, will not have to repeat what China has done for the past 20, 30
but
years.
But hope is one thing. Make sure it doesn't happen is another thing.
Right, such that if somehow that we can, because for example, China to begin with use very low technology, but now we have the advanced technology. In fact, our coal-fired power system is the best in the world, most efficient in the world. And also we have wind and solar and others. So I'm hoping that by China join and also together with the country in Road and Belt initiative to use most advanced technology, such that you don't repeat what China has been done in the past. That I think is very important, not only demonstration, also actual participation of China in the Road and Belt initiative. Now, having said that, I think that different countries, as I mentioned, have different approaches. What we can do here is to advocate together with China, Chinese government, and others to advocate that a sense of urgency into the green system, such that every country where looking at development goals at the same time, remember that we don't want to repeat those polluted periods, and we can try to do better and get greener.
But, Mr. Secretary, we are coming from the emerging economy, so we know the reality. Well, it could be true in the developed countries as well, that there are so many different levels of sophistication among the industries, policymakers in our own respective economies. And therefore, what Professor Lin had just said, the best practices, maybe that could be best done by some of the very high level of sophistication. And yet, to the general picture, it could still be a challenge. And that's a result of this. When emerging economies is partnering with one another, with developing countries as well, how can we make sure the best practice will be the first choice and the choice almost for everybody?
I think that we have to create incentives for developing economies to adopt sustainable infrastructure and also to pay attention to new solutions for old problems.
What kinds of incentives are you talking about?
Well, it of course has to do with a regulatory framework. It has to do with access to finance. It has to do with human capital and things like that. So that, take the case of BRI. BRI is a huge project, is a huge program, more than $1 trillion.
And it's evolving.
It is evolving. China will be leading several projects in different countries. This is a huge opportunity for China to introduce and to popularize sustainable infrastructure, new technologies that use new solutions, environmental friendly solutions. So other governments could also do that. So one important thing, again, is related to regulations. It is related to policies, and it is also related to the access to these new technologies. So that there is a lot for the public and the private sector to do together here.
Ms. Hilton?
I agree, it's an enormous opportunity for leadership. I think that China really needs to exercise the right kind of leadership on Belt and Road. Because, you know, you're talking about a population in all the countries of Belt and Road that is roughly 3 times China's population, with roughly a third of China's median income. They want to develop. China's decisions on finance, on the kind of projects that it offers, on the kind of development aid that it gives, will determine how those countries develop, simply because China's the biggest thing in the room. You know, if China finances building coal in third countries, that coal will be built, and it is being built now. China has the most advanced coal plants in China. The ones China's building in Egypt or in Southeast Asia are not the most advanced, and they're locking these countries into a high carbon trajectory. Other financial institutions, multilaterals, don't finance coal anymore. China still does. So there's a leadership gap here, which I know China would like to fulfill. You don't want to have the kind of scrutiny that says China's doing well at home, but look what it's doing abroad. It's not measuring up. So this is the leadership opportunity that China has, and it would be really wonderful if it was to take full advantage of it.
Professor Lin, I need to invite your expertise here. First of all, a concept to be cleared. whether the Belt and Road Initiative is a China initiative, or is it an initiative that China joins hands with the others, and there's a decision-making process in which all the parties also play a role? I think that is the first thing that we need to clarify here.
Right. I think that the initiative should be on together with all other countries. This is a cross-country project. China cannot determine which project should be done and which project should not be done. There should be a mutual agreement. In other words, if those countries asking for something and China would have considered that whether it should be offered or not, that it's a process going on there. You're right, China has more advantage technology compared to other countries, and also has a possibly better financial situation compared to other countries. Now, let me go back to that comment on the coal-fired power plant. For many developing countries, energy is in shortage. Now, it's a matter of how to use it. Let's say if we do not put in a coal-fired power plant, the other means will have to be used. And those means is quite possibly less efficient and possibly more polluted, just like traditional way of burning the coal or etc. So in the short run, it might be good to build a bigger power plant to meet the development needs. At the same time, to take out all the traditional ineffective consumptions. We have to keep in mind that the carbon capture is on the way. We are hoping that, yes, that will lock in and for some periods of time. But we are hoping that to address the short-run situation, we also have some backup, such as a carbon capture in the future, that we can really put into those power plants and make it make it carbon-free. That is a longer picture, but there's a evaluation of short and long. For example, like China, it is better for China to go for wind and solar altogether right now to meet the energy demand, but it's not possible. So at the meantime, we have a choice of natural gas or coal.
Yes.
And China is now pushing for natural gas. The reason it doesn't be because that China to run like renewables. Those are very clean, but just too small. The incremental cannot be the incremental demand, and therefore have to choose alternative. And we're looking at coal, solar, nuclear, everything, and finally we find out that the natural gas possible is better for the medium to short.
Talking about the coal power plant, Mr. Monfort, I have to go to you because you know your situation very well back at home. I understand the United States now is beginning once again to give incentives to power plants, particularly coal power plants, with this administration. How do you see it within the framework of developed economies? And how do you see the argument that the other guests have been making about make sure the tools, the mechanisms being used are most suitable for the kinds of economy and the kinds of energy that is available to that specific country? Mr. Monfort.
Well, I think in the case of the United States that coal is not something that will be sustainable or profitable in the future. But I'd like to go back to the idea of as China is beginning to export its financing for mega infrastructure development programming. In China here, they're using strategic environmental and social assessments and environmental impact assessments, and they're doing, I think, a good job in that way. It's going in the right direction. But as you move out into developing countries, the question is, how will those same principles be applied? And in my view, they should be. If China wants to show leadership, then it should insist that these high standards of practice are maintained and there are linkages to the financing for these programs. But getting back to one of my original points, which is, if you want to know whether or not you have been successful in achieving your targets, you first need to know what the baseline is. And I'm telling you, in my own experience in North Africa with oil exploration in the Sahara Desert, I saw a situation where Chinese investment was in this exploration. When they come in, they're given special protection and privileges. There's no transparency. There's absolutely no way to monitor. And I can tell you that lots of damage is done in the dark. So there needs to be transparency. There needs to be universal standards. There needs to be integration of conservation and development practice. That would be global leadership.
Let me come to Professor Lin as well, because China has been mentioned so much in this discussion. About Mr. Monfort's point, I wondered whether to clarify another concept. That is, whether China is doing these things in order to claim the so-called leadership title. What is the end goal of this? Is this goal about a title, or is this goal about developing China's own sustainable approach together with the other economies as well. I think that is a crucial point to be clarified. And meanwhile, while China is doing it, should others also join? Because this is not about one country, whether United States or the UK or China or Brazil, but rather how people and countries can work together in order to achieve a common goal. So is it about one country doing it and the others say, oh, let's take a look at what they are doing? Or rather, one country is doing it and the other countries join in and say, let's do it together. I think there's a very different, in terms of the nature that we're talking about here, if it is a global goal we're discussing. Professor Lin.
I think that the
and then I
global
call to Mr. Secretary.
Of a Belt and Road Initiative shouldn't be how other people view China as a leader. That's a different story. But should be partner. Should be partner together for sustainable development. In other words, China at least two things can demonstrate to a particular developing countries. One is that we don't want to repeat what China has been done in the past. That's one. And a lot of Chinese experience can apply. United States, European Union might not be applied to those countries, but Chinese one can be applied to those countries. That's one. Second one, by setting the advanced technology, that's in the sense that there's advanced compared to the developing countries' situations. So I think if these two together, that if somehow China can play a role of partner, a strong partner in supporting the low and bare countries' development, that would be good. Together, as I mentioned earlier, getting better and getting greener. That should be the target. Yeah.
That should be the goal.
Right.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, I think that because we are talking about a global issue, a global agenda, we have to, for us to be successful, we have to develop public goods. And for that to happen, we have to work together in order to develop the policies and to share technologies needed for all of us to do more and better. That requires a common agenda, that requires something that is not perhaps happening at the pace that I would like to see, which is a kind of a rush between countries in order to develop the technologies, the markets for leading this agenda. If we really understand this as a common goal, as a global topic, as a global agenda that requires working together, collaboration, co-creation, we have to do more in terms of sharing knowledge, getting access to these technologies to everyone.
Well, we have quite limited time for this wonderful discussion. I think everybody comes in very frankly from your own perspective, which is what the discussion should be about. But I have much smarter audience than the host sitting here with us today. I see quite a number of familiar faces who have been instrumental in your own economies and your own field about sustainable development and also about green leadership yourself. So may I call on you who have comments and questions, suggestions to speak your mind. Shall we go to this gentleman first? Professor Qi, good to see you.
Well, thank you. Good
Why don't you introduce yourself and then
Tian
say your comments and questions.
Quick comment and a question for Professor Lin and Ms. Hilton. My comments is about the carbon peak. We have recently published a piece on carbon peak, and we realized this phrase carbon peak can be misleading. In fact, according to our study, we have entered a phase of carbon plateau starting 2014, and that can last for a decade long until 2024. It's not going to decline. The carbon emission is not going to decline until after 2024. So this is a long period of time. Then
and therefore, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, this is do not expect a peak, then a sharp decline real quickly. They will last for a while. This has a lot to do, of course, with the economic slowdown, but it also has a lot to do with the long-term target for total energy consumption made by China, 2016, and also the substitution of coal and other fossil fuel with solar and wind. My question for Professor Lin is there any factor you identify that we see in the future a search, the research of carbon emission? And also for Isabel, given that we have not seen any significant success for carbon market worldwide, what are the reasons we should expect China will succeed in carbon market? Thank you.
Wonderful. I'll collect the question and get the answer together. Thank you so much. And I see some other familiar faces. Mr. Zhang, 这边. Introduce yourself if you want.
Thank you. This is Zhang Jianyu from Environment Defense Fund. I just want to have several comments with regard to the green leader. There's a Chinese saying that, 听其言观其行, so you listen to what they say, but more important to watch what they do. So look at China. That's, let's sort of do the analysis. First, China definitely has said that, in the 19th Party Congress report, President Xi said, in the field of climate change, China not only wants to be a participant, a contributor, but also want to be a torch leader. So they actually say that. And then let's see what China has done. That we all know about the situation in Beijing, about the air pollution disaster, quote unquote. But we know China has advanced the progress in cleaning up and in well advanced of the original plan in the past 3 years. And they have started to make a new plan. And also this peaking thing that Professor Qi talked about. I just actually, for a quick comment on the peaking, I think peaking is real, right? Whether China has set up the target, the peaking is real. But more importantly, I want to say whether we should examine whether China has taken on the leadership, which I think it is. I mean, we're talking about building the largest carbon market in the world. But Isabel, to answer your question, the EU has started to reform their system because China is building. So we actually see the surge in EU price from $5 to 18 euros right now. And we just saw in California that California is actually first trying to adopt and buy some credits from Brazil of your REDD, anti-deforestation, avoid deforestation credits. So that leadership has already been examined. Lastly, I just want to say that I think we want people to compete for the leadership, green leadership. There should be no shyness of being the green leader in the world, because that's still going to be the universal common language every human being should use.
You got all geared up and us scared up as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Zhang. Any other comments coming from the other audience members? Yes, this lady, please. 这边中间这一边尽快.
I'm Zhou Chen from Caixin Media. I'd like to ask, as we can see, there are not many audiences here. I don't know if you are satisfied with the situation about this kind of public awareness on climate change. Are you satisfied?
I think this is not maybe not a good example because it's an early morning session. Yeah. So, do you have other more profound questions than this?
I think it's quite important to gain public awareness on climate change now.
Okay.
And our other guests here, they just think the policymakers and governance is quite
okay, great.
key.
Any other comments? The further down there, that gentleman over there, at the back? Yes.
Hi, my name is Doug Woodring from Ocean Recovery Alliance. I just wonder if any of the panelists know if China, in the debate about tariffs, had thought about if we're going to do tit-for-tat tariff rebuttal anyway, why they did not, or could they, rebut with a tariff on carbon to the US as part of a statement to the world that they're leading. Because then you would have every country who signed the Paris Agreement on the side of China supporting that. And I'm wondering why this didn't happen, and still, could it happen? And the next question is...
So you are here to helping China to fight a trade war against the United States?
That's correct.
China is not starting anything, but China certainly...
It's about the environment, and it's about a PR angle for the environment. If
okay.
you're going to bicker on tariffs, you might as well do it for something good.
Got it.
The
Second point
is, are you using or talking about clean tax cuts and barrier-free green capital markets between countries, which is essentially the exact opposite of tariff barriers for the green industries that you are trying to promote?
Thank you, sir. Is that it? Final question, final comments. We have to be quick. Our answer has to be very brief after this.
I'm Yaroslav from Ukraine and work in green economy sector. We have very dynamic bioenergy, which is like 35% growing each year in Ukraine. So I'm just wondering how it's going in China with solid biomass sector and overall bioenergy. Like, what's the role of green economy in China?
What is the role of
solid biomass sector and bioenergy overall?
I see. Okay.
Thank you.
I think we have collected a lot of comments and also approaches. Let me come back to the panel very briefly, if we can. First of all, about some of the ways of doing things. Whether the carbon market is working in China, in the EU, for example, rooms to improve, and whether we should use other tools such as green tax cuts, clean energy tax cuts, things like that, in order to really make the system work. Let me have the comments coming from some of you. I think Isabel and also Professor Lin. Yes, please, Ms. Hilton,
so
very briefly.
Why would the market succeed in China when it hasn't done that much good in Europe is a very good question. I would hope that experience is accumulated, and I would think also that the power of the central government to set prices is stronger than if you're negotiating 27 countries' different interests. You know, the European Union has a more crabwise approach. China does have an opportunity to set terms and standards, so perhaps. And anyway, there are co-benefits to setting up a system, which I outlined earlier. In terms of public awareness, most polling now says that, yes, indeed, the public is aware of climate change. And even in the United States, overwhelmingly, they would like the government to take action. I don't think that there's been a capture of kind of political high ground, if you like, by the resistance to climate action in this shape of special interest. But the public actually gets it, and I think would like to see more action taken.
Whether they're here for this morning session is one thing, because this is only a discussion, it's early morning session. But if you ask people in China, in Beijing, in Tianjin, in Dalian, in many other cities about the environment and the air quality, everybody is more than so-called aware. The question is whether they want to be aware and at the same time do something. So all the audience coming over here for the morning session, you're great. But anyway, let's throw it back to Professor Lin, some of the brief comments to your colleagues and friends.
Let me answer very briefly about Professor Chi's question. Right now, for the carbon to be negative in China, the coal had to be negative, because we all know that for now until 2024, as you mentioned the time, the gas and oil demand will continue to increase to be positive. So we need a negative coal to offset the positive from gas and oil. Now why the coal could be positive or not really depends on the economic demand, energy demand, which is very difficult to predict. For example, the economy today is not as good as possibly as the economy 3 years ago. But the energy demand is much higher than 3 years ago. So that got to do with the industrial structure, got to do with this economic activity. So what I want to say is pretty difficult to predict at this moment. I'm hoping that when the renewable green big enough, such that we don't have to depend on coal to be negative, then we have a chance of the negative demand.
All right, Mr. Monfort, I know I shouldn't pick on you, but I have to pick on you about whether the so-called trade war should be fighting in an environmental way.
I'm going to stay out of that. But I want to say, though, that the awareness issue, I think, in the United States is very high. And I think there's a sense of hopelessness on some level. People don't know what to do. When given alternatives that are environmentally sound, that help to contribute to solving the problem, they take them, but they need better solutions in the market.
Yes, Mr. Secretary, of course, I would love to invite your wisdom as well about the governance issue many have mentioned over here.
Yeah, I have two takes on that. One is, again, because this is a global topic, it requires a global governance. And the second topic related to awareness that somebody raised. One thing is being aware, and the second thing is related to if people are okay to paying the cost for doing more and better in terms of environmental protection. So that's why we need a policy that prevents free riding, both at the domestic level and at the global level as well. So there is a lot to do here.
Well, I have to say, ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time for a very brief discussion about a gigantic project. And I have to say, of all of our panelists, they are very frank and direct, while at the same time instrumental constructive in putting forward their suggestions about the issue. And you are great at the same time in helping us to go much deeper about the topic and to take a look at it with the whole background behind us. Thank you so much for being with us. And that is all the time we have for this special program of World Insight with Tian Wei on CGTN. This is a joint session between China Global Television Network and the World Economic Forum. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it.